Welcome to the Connor's Corner segment of Ask the Lawyer. April 1947. Very important event happened in Brooklyn. To help tell us what happened in Brooklyn in 1947 is National Fox News Channel correspondent Ed Henry. How you doing?
Great to be on with you.
Okay, so what happened in April 1947 in Brooklyn?
Well, of course, Jackie Robinson trotted out to first base. He later moved, of course, to second base. But on April 15th of 47, he played his first game. And a lot of books have been written about it. A great moment, not just in baseball history, of course, but civil rights history, American history. And I chose to write this book called 42 Faith because I actually wanted to rewind the tape 2 years earlier in 1945 in Brooklyn, where I learned a little bit of new information, a little historical twist, which is that most of the books and movies and whatnot that have been written about Jackie Robinson and Branch Rickey, the general manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers, have made it seem like Branch Rickey was so religious that he was dead certain that it was the right thing to do to integrate baseball and never really wavered. But I found some new information suggesting that right before he signed Jackie to his first contract in 45, Rickey had a secret meeting with the minister at Plymouth Church in Brooklyn Heights, where he revealed he had some second thoughts. He had some cold feet. He wasn't sure if he could really go through with it. But by the end of this meeting of pacing and praying and talking to this minister, he decided it was the right thing to do and that he was prepared to take the plunge. And learning this new information sent me on a journey to kind of figure out how much of a role did faith in God play, not just for Branch Rickey in making this big monumental decision right there in Brooklyn, but also how important of a role was faith in God for Jackie Robinson, because he was somebody who was a kid who came from a broken home. He joined a gang when he was a teenager, and it was a Christian minister out in Pasadena, California, that actually pulled him out of the gang and said, "You're going to waste all this athletic talent unless you get your life in gear." And so I wrote this book because I think it's a book that baseball fans will love, and I certainly love baseball. I'm from New York, and I'm jealous of the people who grew up in the 40s and 50s watching three fabulous teams duke it out with the Dodgers, Giants, and Yankees. But I also think if you're serious about your faith and it's a subject that matters to you, this is a book, 42 Faith, that you're going to really love.
Okay, now this is an aspect that really hasn't been covered before. You know, if you watch 42, the movie, I don't think there was that much about faith in that movie.
No, if you remember, there's one line that's pretty humorous. I have no evidence in all of my years of research that it was ever uttered by Branch Rickey, but Harrison Ford, playing Branch Rickey, says, "I'm a Methodist, Jackie's a Methodist, and God is a Methodist. We can't lose," right? I mean, it sounds almost too perfect. It's very Hollywood. And that's the way they handled it. I mean, if you also think back to that meeting in the movie 42, where Harrison Ford is sort of beating up on Jackie Robinson and saying, you know, they're going to shout the N-word, and they're going to do this. They won't let you stay at the hotel. They won't let you eat at the restaurant, and tried to provoke him. At the end of that, the point of it was that he wanted Jackie to know that, yes, you need to be courageous. Yes, you need to fight when you need to fight. But most of the time in the early years of this experiment, and it was an experiment, they didn't know it was going to work, and thank God it did work, Jackie couldn't really fight back because it would blow up the whole thing. And people would say, "Oh, he's an angry black man, and he can't take it, and he's really not able to play with white players." It's absurd now to think back to how people thought. But I think Branch Rickey realized that Brooklyn and New York City was the ultimate melting pot, was then, is now, as you know better than anyone. And this was the place for the experiment. This was the moment. And so at the end of that other meeting, I told you about the secret meeting with the minister, but at the end of the other meeting in August 45 in Rickey's office, where Rickey was trying to provoke Jackie, remember what he said at the end of that? He said, "You need to turn the other cheek." That's the history of it. And that reminded me that there were all kinds of layers of faith in this story, from both of their childhoods, both Rickey and Robinson, right through their days with the Dodgers. And I think that's what bound them together. They had almost nothing in common. Different races, different regions of the country they came from, different generations, but they were bound together by baseball and faith.
What was Branch Rickey's background in 1945-46?
You know, he had been with the Cardinals before as an executive. He was a very shrewd executive, won a few World Series, and also, people may forget, created the modern farm system. So this whole idea that the Yankees and the Mets have minor league teams that feed the big club talent, that was started all by Branch Rickey. But there's another moment that people don't know a lot about. In the early 1900s, he grew up on a farm in Ohio. As I mentioned, a Methodist. His parents were very religious and instilled that in him early. And he went to his mom and said, "I want to be a big league ball player. Most people don't know that about Ricky. They know him as an executive. But he played big league ball like Jackie did as well. But his mom initially said, no, all ball players do is drink and swear and chase women. And so Ricky, undeterred, slept on it, came back to his mom and said, will you let me chase my dream to be a big league ball player on one condition, that I never play on Sunday? His mom thought about it and said, okay. And so he did become a big league ball player, never played on Sundays, one of many reasons why he was eventually cut out of the major leagues. In other words, that he was a light hitter, he had a bad throwing arm, and he was a catcher. If you're a catcher, you need a strong throwing arm. But also, when he was a world-famous general manager for the Dodgers and working with Jackie Robinson, Carl Erskine, and Ralph Franklin, and all the rest, he still did not go to Ebbets Field on Sunday. He was this guy with this larger-than-life presence, the cigar chomping, the bow tie, the hat, the whole thing. He was a real character. But he wouldn't go to Ebbets Field on Sundays because he wanted, even after his parents had died, because he wanted to honor that promise to his mom, and he wanted to honor her faith and his faith. I think it says a lot about Branch Rickey's character.
Jackie Robinson, 1945. Tell us something about him at that point.
Well, in 1945, Jackie Robinson had just been in the Negro Leagues. He played for the Kansas City Monarchs for just a few months. And he really wasn't the best player in the Negro Leagues. There were guys like Satchel Paige, a great pitcher who, when he got to Barnstorm, didn't really get his crack at the big leagues until he was in his 40s after Jackie came up. But he would be able to strike out Joe DiMaggio and all the rest on these barnstorming tours. You had Josh Gibson, a great catcher who hit all kinds of home runs, tape measure shots. He didn't get his shot. And then you had Cool Papa Bell, and I don't know if you remember him, but he was the guy who was so fast as a Negro Leagues player. The legend was that on the road, he'd get into the hotel room at night, he'd turn off the light switch, and before the room got dark, he'd be under the covers in bed getting ready to go to sleep. I think that was probably a slight exaggeration, but it gives you an idea that there are other players maybe with better talent, but nobody had the combination that Jackie Robinson had, which is that he was a four-letter man at UCLA, basketball, football, baseball, and track and field. That was the first time anyone had done that at that great athletic institution. And even after putting it all on the line on the gridiron on Saturdays for the UCLA football team, on Sunday mornings, he would still go and teach Sunday school at the same Methodist church where he had grown up on in Pasadena. Why did he do that? Because there was a minister there named Carl Downs, Reverend Carl Downs, who pulled Jackie out of the gang. He had been in a gang because he was raised by a single mom, didn't have a father around, joined this gang, and this minister said, you better pull yourself out of this gang or you're going to ruin all this athletic talent. Jackie listened to him, and it left enough of an imprint that, number one, Jackie still taught Sunday school, as I mentioned, at UCLA, and number two, his wife, Rachel Robinson, who's still alive, remembers that Jackie, every night in that rookie season of 1947, he'd come home from Ebbets Field, and before he went to sleep, he'd get down on his hands and knees and pray. And that was something his mom instilled in him in Pasadena. And so I think Jackie Robinson was someone who had very deep faith. He didn't wear it on his sleeve the way Branch Rickey did, but I think it really mattered to him. It was in his heart. It was in his soul. And I think it made a difference in terms of him turning the other cheek against the abuse. But also, how do you sustain yourself? How do you rise above all of the attacks, all of the slams? You got to have faith in God, and I think that was sort of the secret sauce here.
We're talking to Ed Henry about his book, 42 Faith, about Jackie Robinson, Branch Rickey, and the breaking of the color barrier in the 1940s. Welcome back to the Connor's Corner segment of Ask the Lawyer. We're talking to Ed Henry about his book, 42 Faith, the story of Jackie Robinson. What was the kind of abuse? I think some of us have a hard time understanding what people were like back then.
The movie 42 got into it a little bit. There was a manager for the Philadelphia Phillies, Ben Chapman, who, in one particular game was, I don't want to repeat some of it, but, some of it that I could repeat. He basically said, go back to the jungle and, why don't you come over here and shine our shoes? Typical stereotypes of the 40s. That somebody might shout at a black person maybe on a street or something, but the idea that it happened on a ball field, pretty remarkable. And I think ironically and thankfully, it turned around on people like Ben Chapman. Some of the white teammates on the Dodgers who had initially been skeptical of Jackie joining the team, they were revolted. They were in revolt over this, the idea that an opposing manager would say these awful things about their teammate. So it sort of led them to kind of rally around Jackie. And so I think some of the attacks backfired. But when you ask, beyond just verbal abuse, which is bad enough, Jackie's life was threatened many, many times. And in fact, on opening day, 1947, that you asked me about at the beginning, there was a credible report that there was going to be a sharpshooter somewhere outside Ebbets Field on a building or somewhere, and somebody wrote a letter or a phone call and promised, you put Jackie out on that field, I'm going to gun him down. And the players were briefed on it before the game. And Ralph Branca, who just passed away a couple months ago, big, tall, white pitcher, a white teammate who you might have thought, well, maybe he's not on board with Jackie. He made a show, actually, of standing next to Jackie during the opening day, announcements where they introduce all the players on the field. They typically do that even now. And rather than run from Jackie, Branca stood right next to him. And after the game, one of Branca's brothers came up to him and said, Ralphie, what in the world were you thinking? They wanted to shoot Jackie. And he just looked at his brother and said, there are worse ways to go than to stand up for your teammate. And so that might get lost in this sometimes, too. There were, we can't whitewash history. There were white teammates from the Deep South who circulated that petition in the spring training of 47 saying, if you promote Jackie to the big club, we're going to walk. And that was awful. And that backfired as well, by the way. But then there were white teammates like Ralph Branca and Carl Erskine, who's one of the only living Brooklyn Dodgers, 90 years old, in Anderson, Indiana. I interviewed him several times. A joy to do that. He's still sharp as a tack, has some wonderful stories about those old days of the Brooklyn Dodgers. And he also has a strong Christian faith like Ralph Branca did. And Erskine stood up for Jackie Robinson early. So we can't whitewash the fact that there were people who did not stand up for Jackie. It was not all sweetness and light. But there were other teammates who certainly rallied to his side, and that's one of the points of my book. So if you're a baseball fan, you're going to love it.
How did Jackie Robinson get there were a lot of great players for the Dodgers in the 40s and 50s. How did he get along with the other stars on the team?
Pee Wee Reese started out as being one of the skeptics. He was the captain of the team, and obviously one of the best players. And they ended up getting along famously. Reese was might have had a cold relationship at first because, remember, Reese was serving in the military at the end of World War II when Jackie was signed in 45. And word got to his ship as he was coming back to America that the Dodgers had just signed a black player to a minor league contract. And one of his shipmates said, Pee Wee, here's the most amazing part. He's a shortstop. And Pee Wee stopped thinking, wait, I'm over here serving my country. And they might have not just hired a black player, but a black player to replace me. And Pee Wee later told, like Larry King, for example, the broadcaster who wrote the introduction to my book, he told Larry and others in his later years that he felt bad, Pee Wee, that he initially didn't want Jackie to join the team. And the reason was pure racism, that Pee Wee was from Louisville, Kentucky, and the folks back home would say, according to Pee Wee, you lost your job to a black man, except he used a word that starts with N that we don't use anymore. And Pee Wee felt bad about that later because he became one of Jackie's closest friends. So look, there were teammates that were cold to him, but a lot of them ended up coming over to Jackie's side because they realized he was a courageous man, and his actions spoke so much louder than words. He had a great athletic talent, but this is someone who was dealing with a lot of abuse, and yet excelled on the field and off the field as well. He was known as a great teammate in the clubhouse. How
far does your book go into Jackie Robinson post-baseball career? Or?
Yeah, I get into a fair bit in the 1960s. He sadly died so early in 1972 at the age of 53. He had diabetes, and I think, frankly, the stress of being the first was too much for him. But I get into a lot of what he was doing in the 60s. Now, people remember that he worked for Chock full of nuts because, frankly, back in those days, ball players didn't make a lot of money. And even though he was the world-famous Jackie Robinson, he didn't have a lot of dough. And so he worked for Chock full of nuts, the coffee company, became a big spokesman for them, an executive, and was very proud of that work because Chock full of nuts made a big deal about hiring more African Americans in other companies. And so Jackie was very proud of that. But the reason why I get into his time in the 60s in the book is that Jackie in the 60s gave a lot of sermons in a lot of churches around the country. And that's why it ties back into the message of 42 Faith, which is that during some of the race riots of the 60s, people were looking for leadership, not just from Dr. King, but from leaders like Jackie Robinson. And I find it instructive as well that Jackie didn't just give speeches on street corners or, at arenas. He gave a lot of sermons at churches all around the country, not just black churches, churches all around the country. spreading the message that he believed that the way different races came together was all laid out in the gospel, that it was all about being, kind to your fellow man, your fellow person, and that it wasn't really to Jackie that complicated. And he really was getting fed up with the race riots, the long, hot summer of '67, for example. He gave a long sermon at church in New Rochelle, New York, that I quote extensively in the book, where he said, look, the way you come together is by following the gospel. And that's why I really think Jackie Robinson's faith from his time as a child in Pasadena, instilled in him by his mother, who's very religious, Reverend Carl Downs, who I mentioned before, who pulled him out of that gang. Then Branch Rickey also had a faith dimension to his life, instilled that in Jackie as well as a player. And I think long after he had hung up his spikes for the Dodgers, Jackie was somebody who really had a strong faith in the center of his life, and I think it made all the difference for him.
I think it's pretty clear why you decided to write this book. What do you think people should take away from it?
I really hope that people take away that if you're a baseball fan, I've got so many great stories about what it was like in Jackie's first season, not just on the field, but in the clubhouse. And then I go through the 1951 shot heard around the world, October 3rd, 1951, which a lot of your listeners, I bet, will remember and remember well. I spent a lot of time with Jerry Reinstar, for example. He's a character in my book. He's now known as the owner of the White Sox and the Bulls in Chicago, but he actually grew up in Flatbush and was at Jackie's first game. And he talks to me about how October 3rd, 1951 was one of the worst days of his life as a Dodger. He's now a billionaire, and he still winces at the Dodgers blowing that game against the Giants. Branca throwing the pitch to Bobby Thompson. So I've got, if you're a baseball fan, I've got so many great stories in here. I talked to Vince Scully, the broadcaster who just retired, who just, was close to Jackie and Pee Wee and the rest, and has some wonderful tales from the Dodger dugout. But what I want people to take more than anything is that Jackie didn't do this alone. He did this in partnership with Branch Rickey. He did it with teammates like Ralph Branca and Carl Erskine, who stood up for him when it took a lot to do that, because there was a lot of pressure to not support Jackie. And what I found is that what bound a lot of these Dodgers together, the boys of, we celebrate them as the boys of summer, but what hasn't been talked about out loud a lot is that a lot of these players, Gil Hodges as well, a Catholic, they really had faith at the center of their lives. And so I think it was a lot more than just, beer and the crack of the bat and all the wonderful things now that the baseball season is back that gets me excited and passionate about this game I love so much. It was a lot more than that for these Dodgers, especially Jackie Robinson.
And, one final thought. We really haven't spent too much time on how great a ball player Jackie Robinson was. I mean, today, on-base percentages, things like that,
Yeah, I mean, Rookie of the Year in 47, under all that pressure, so many years that, he was stealing bases. And, I talked to Larry King, I mentioned it. He was at a lot of Jackie's games, and he talks about the way that Jackie just simply mesmerized the fans and would basically have the other team literally pulling their hair out, because if he got in a pickle where he's in the old rundown between first and second, they'd have 5, 6, 7 players trying to run him down, and they couldn't do it. He was so quick. He was just so quick. And he brought that, we talk now about these 5-tool players who hit for average and hit for power, and they can run, and they can field, and they can throw. Jackie was almost the original 5-tool player. And I also talked to the son of a late sports writer who's very close to Jackie, who reveals that Jackie, before he was elected to the Hall of Fame, felt bad because he said, I don't want to be elected. I don't want to be inducted in the Hall of Fame as the first black player. I just don't want to be. And this sports writer, Joe Reichler, kept telling him, Jackie, you're getting in for both. Yes, the fact that you were the first, the fact that you left such a mark on America, not just baseball, that's a reason to get in the Hall of Fame. But your numbers are fabulous. Your play out on the field merits being in the Hall of Fame. And let's not forget, as a final point, when you compare him to DiMaggio and Ted Williams, I mean, Ted Williams lost time as well because of the Korean War, and we should note that, but he still was able to hit 521 home runs. Jackie didn't start when he was 18 years old, like a Bryce Harper, a modern-day player for the Washington Nationals. He didn't start early enough. He came up when he was 28 years old, simply because he was a black man, simply because he did not get an opportunity. You think about adding 8 or 10 years to anyone who looks it up right now on Wikipedia. Jackie still has good numbers. You add 8, 9, 10 seasons to that, he might have had one of the greatest careers of anyone. But it was robbed of him simply because of his race. I don't want to dwell on the negative part. I think the best part, and what I want people to take away from the 42 Faith more than anything, is Jackie rose above all that negativity and stood up, not just for his teammates, he stood up for his race, and was a class act. And I think that's the legacy he leaves more than anything.
The name of the book, 42 Faith by Ed Henry. Thank you for writing this book. We look forward to reading it.
Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you again.